It was a solemn day, and the mourners had gathered around the grave, their faces etched with sorrow. A horse-drawn carriage, bearing the coffin of a beloved family member, slowly made its way to the burial site. The air was thick with grief, and the soft murmurs of the guests whispered among the trees. The priest had just begun to speak the opening prayers when, without warning, the atmosphere was shattered by a loud, frantic neigh. The horse pulling the coffin suddenly panicked. It reared up, kicking its hooves in the air and thrashing wildly. Before anyone could react, the animal bolted straight into the procession. The mourners scattered in every direction, their hearts racing with confusion and terror. The horse trampled over the coffin, sending it crashing to the ground. The sharp, crackling sound of wood splintering echoed through the air. The stunned crowd watched in horror as the coffin shattered open, and for a split second, there was an eerie silence. But then, through the chaos and dust, something even more unsettling happened. From within the broken coffin, there was a noise, a low, muffled sound that couldn't be ignored. At first, it was barely audible, like a faint groan. But as the seconds passed, the mourners began to realize that it wasn't the wind, nor the sounds of the breaking wood. It was a cry, a desperate, haunting wail, almost like someone trapped inside, trying to call out for help. The crowd stood frozen in disbelief. What was happening? How could this be? The funeral had already been marred by the unexpected tragedy of a horse running wild, but now this? The cries from inside the broken coffin grew louder, more insistent. They weren't the sounds of grief or mourning, but something much more terrifying. It was impossible for the people there to comprehend what was going on. Was the deceased somehow alive? Had the body inside the coffin somehow, not truly died? The idea was absurd, but the cries refused to stop. In a haze of confusion, the mourners looked at each other, some terrified and others frozen in shock. Was it a trick? A cruel joke, perhaps? But no one could explain what they had just heard. The coffin lay broken on the ground, its contents spilled out, and the eerie cries continued. One of the attendants, a man in his late 60s, was the first to break the silence. He rushed forward, trembling, but as his hand reached for the coffin, a wave of dread washed over him. He hesitated. Something was terribly wrong, and instinct told him not to touch it. From the crowd, someone screamed. Another cried out for help, calling for an ambulance. But it was too late, nothing could prepare them for what happened next. The priest, shaken to his core, stepped forward. He reached for the coffin, but his voice trembled as he spoke. This isn't possible. This isn't supposed to happen. The attendees, now in a state of panic, looked to each other for answers. What could this all mean? What was happening with the horse? And more pressing, what about the cries from inside the coffin? No one could deny what they had just heard. In that moment, an unsettling silence fell over the crowd. The priest stepped back from the scene, his hands raised in prayer, while others began to pull away in shock. But despite the fear, no one could turn away. They stood at the edge of something so mysterious, so unnatural, that it felt like they had stepped into a nightmare. As whispers spread throughout the crowd, everyone knew one thing for sure: the events of this funeral were no ordinary accident. The cries, the sudden panic, the strange behavior of the horse, they were all pieces of a puzzle that no one had the answers to. And as the dust settled and the shock began to wear off, one question lingered in everyone's mind: what was the true story behind the cries in the coffin? The events of that day would never be forgotten. But the mystery surrounding the cries was only the beginning. It would take a deep dive into the family's past, long-buried secrets, and unanswered questions to uncover what really happened that day. But for now, the mourners stood frozen, unsure of what to believe. The shocking turn of events had left them all with more questions than answers. As the confusion began to settle, the authorities arrived at the scene. The emergency responders quickly took control of the situation, and the horse was led away from the wreckage. The shattered coffin was carefully examined, and the cries that had echoed from within now seemed impossible to ignore. Some of the mourners stepped back, feeling as if they had crossed into an unknown world where reality itself had been shattered. The priest, still shaken by what he had witnessed, gathered himself enough to continue the ceremony, though no one could really focus. All the plans for the day had been disrupted, and the funeral had now become something altogether different. Instead of offering comfort and closure, it had morphed into something resembling a nightmare. The family of the deceased stood at a distance, watching in disbelief. They had not known what to expect when they had arrived that morning, but nothing had prepared them for the horror they were now facing. Among them was the eldest son, a quiet man with a somber face, who appeared unusually distant from the chaos unfolding around him. He didn't speak much, but his eyes betrayed a deep concern, one that went beyond just the tragedy of his father's funeral. The cries from the coffin had ceased, but the air was thick with an undeniable sense of dread. It was as if the funeral had disturbed something long buried, something that should have remained hidden forever. And as the crowd began to disperse, whispers began to swirl. "What happened with that horse?" someone asked, "and why were there those strange cries?" "I've never heard anything like that," another person murmured. The family, now faced with the looming mystery, had no answers. The youngest daughter, visibly distressed, clutched her mother's arm as she trembled. What if Dad's not really gone?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her mother shook her head, trying to calm her. "Don't say that. He's gone. We have to move on." But deep down, they all wondered, could there have been something more to this tragedy? As the days passed and the funeral became just another painful memory, the family tried to go back to their lives, but the unsettling events lingered like an unwanted shadow. The son, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His father had been a quiet man, never one for drama, but what if there was something in his past that no one knew about? Late one night, unable to sleep, he made a decision. He would go through his father's personal belongings, just to see if he could find anything that might explain the oddities of the funeral. He started in the study, carefully searching through drawers and old letters, but it wasn't until he found a worn-out leather journal that things began to take shape. The journal belonged to his father, and as the son flipped through its pages, he was taken aback by what he read. The entries were filled with stories of an unhappy past, of debts, betrayals, and people his father had wronged. But there was one entry that stood out, dated just a few days before his death. "I fear what I've left undone. I can't escape my past, and it haunts me." The words sent a chill down the son's spine. His father had known something was wrong. But what exactly? The journal mentioned a man, someone his father had a falling out with many years ago. The details were unclear, but the son could feel the weight of the mystery growing heavier with each word he read. His father had always been secretive, and now it seemed that the key to the strange events at the funeral might lie in these cryptic notes. Desperate for answers, he reached out to his father's old business partners, but none of them seemed willing to talk. They all gave vague answers, and when pressed further, they changed the subject. It was as though no one wanted to acknowledge what had really happened. But the more he dug, the more the pieces began to fit together in a way that made his skin crawl. The son decided to confront his mother, who had remained tight-lipped about the funeral incident. He asked her directly, "What did Dad do? What happened that day?" She hesitated, a look of fear crossing her face. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "There's something you need to know, something your father was never able to tell you. But it's too late now. The past is the past." But the son wasn't ready to let it go. He could feel it, the whispers in the air, the way the coffin had broken open, and the cries that had haunted them all. The answer was out there, hidden just beneath the surface. Determined to uncover the truth, the son made one final attempt to reach out to someone who might know more. He contacted an old family friend, someone who had been close to his father in the past and who might hold the missing piece of the puzzle. The friend's response was vague, but it was clear that there was something she was holding back. "You need to understand," she said, "your father was involved in something far darker than you know. And what happened at that funeral wasn't an accident." As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, one thing became abundantly clear: the truth was much more sinister than anyone had imagined. The son sat in his dimly lit living room, the old journal in his hands, his mind racing with questions that only seemed to multiply the more he uncovered. His mother's cryptic warnings echoed in his mind, leaving him with an uneasy sense of dread. He couldn't stop thinking about the hidden words his father had written: "I can't escape my past, and it haunts me." Those words, along with the strange cries from the coffin, had taken root in his thoughts. Something deep and unresolved lingered in his father's life, something he'd been too afraid to confront, until now. The phone call with the family friend had left him with more confusion than clarity. "Your father was involved in something far darker than you know," she had said. What did she mean by that? What was his father hiding? And why did it feel like the answers were being deliberately kept from him? The son's determination to uncover the truth only grew stronger. The family was in turmoil. His mother, in particular, seemed to carry a heavy burden, but she refused to speak of it. He noticed the way her eyes would look away when he asked about his father's past, a subtle shift that spoke volumes. The more he pressed her, the more she would retreat, as though the very mention of his father's secrets caused her pain. One evening, after weeks of investigation, the son found himself sitting across from his mother at the dinner table. The air was thick with unspoken words, and the silence between them felt like a heavy fog. He could no longer bear the uncertainty. He had to know what was hidden in their past. "Mom," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "you have to tell me the truth. What happened? What was Dad involved in? Why was his past so dark?" His mother's face went pale, her hands trembling as she placed her fork down with a soft clink. She looked at him, her eyes filled with sorrow, and for the first time in years, he saw a glimpse of the woman who had once been full of warmth and life, not the person consumed by grief and fear. "Your father was caught up in things he shouldn't have been," she said softly, almost as if afraid to speak the words aloud. "Things he never wanted you to know." She paused, collecting her thoughts as if weighing whether to reveal the deepest parts of their family's history. The son waited, his heart pounding in his chest. "Before you were born, your father had a business partner, someone he trusted. But over time, the partnership turned sour. There were debts involved, and people began to make threats. It wasn't just business anymore, it was personal. Your father tried to walk away, but you can never really escape that kind of life. That man he trusted, he didn't let go. And then, well, it all spiraled." The son leaned forward, desperate to understand. "What do you mean it spiraled? What happened to the man?" His mother took a shaky breath, her eyes welling up with tears. "He disappeared. The police never found him. But your father always suspected that he had something to do with it." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "But there was more. A year later, the man's family came after your father. They wanted revenge. That's why your father moved us here, away from the people who might hurt us." The son sat back, his mind reeling. It was all beginning to make sense, yet it felt like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. There were too many questions still left unanswered. What had happened to his father's business partner? Why had the cries come from the coffin during the funeral? And, most chilling of all, why had the horse acted out so violently? He turned to his mother, his voice low but insistent. "What happened at the funeral, Mom? What's the connection between that event and everything you're telling me now?" His mother's face turned a deep shade of red, as if the truth was more than she could bear. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I have my suspicions." The son's heart sank. His mother wasn't ready to tell him everything, but he could sense there was more she wasn't saying. There had to be a connection between the man his father had wronged and the strange events at the funeral. But what was it? As the son continued to dig into his father's past, he found a disturbing piece of evidence that seemed to pull everything together. Among his father's belongings, he discovered an old photograph, a group photo of a family, but one face stood out. It was of the man his father had betrayed, the man who had vanished all those years ago. The son's blood ran cold. This was the face of someone he'd never been told about. The man's name, his business dealings, and the dark side of his father's life were all linked together in this faded picture. But there was one more thing. On the back of the photograph, his father had written a name, his daughter. Could this be the key to understanding the cries at the funeral? The name on the back was a lead, and the son knew that it was time to go further into the past, no matter how painful it would be. The truth was out there, and with every clue, the mystery grew deeper. As he stared at the photograph, something clicked inside him. The cries from the coffin were not just an accident. They were a message tied to the family's darkest secret. And this was only the beginning. The son couldn't shake the feeling that the photograph he had uncovered was a key to something much bigger. As the days passed, the chilling weight of his discovery pressed down on him more and more. The photograph, marked only by the words, his daughter, seemed to be a direct connection to the strange events at the funeral, the cries from the coffin, the violent horse, and the family's long-held secrets. Who was this mysterious woman, and what role had she played in his father's life? Determined to get answers, the son set out to track down anyone who might know about the woman in the photograph. His first stop was the family's old neighborhood, the place where they had lived before moving to a quieter town for safety. He spoke to former neighbors, but none of them seemed willing to talk, their faces growing uncomfortable whenever he mentioned the family his father had once been close to. The silence around him was palpable, and it was clear that this was no ordinary family feud. Something much darker lay beneath the surface. One evening, as the son was walking back to his car, a voice called out from behind him. It was an elderly woman, a neighbor from the old block who had once been friends with his mother. She had a deep-set weariness in her eyes, but there was also a glimmer of something else, perhaps regret, or maybe fear. The son had seen her before, but he never expected her to be the one to reveal the truth. "You're searching for answers, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. He nodded, his heart racing. "I have to know what happened, what my father was involved in. Who was the man he betrayed, and who is the woman in the photograph?" The woman hesitated for a moment before motioning for him to follow her into her house. Inside, the air smelled of old books and dusty furniture, and the creaking of the floorboards added to the feeling of unease. She led him to the back room, where a small collection of old photographs sat on a wooden table. As she carefully pulled out a photo album, she began to speak, her voice quiet but filled with an eerie intensity. "I knew your father, well before the betrayal. He wasn't always the man you remember. He was ambitious, too ambitious for his own good. He made enemies, and that man, the one you're looking for, was his closest friend once. But that man's daughter, she was more than just a casualty of the affair. She was the one who had to pay for your father's mistakes." The woman paused, her fingers trembling as she turned the pages of the album. There, at the very end, was a photograph of a young girl, no older than 12. She had striking eyes, eyes that seemed too old for her age. And beside her was the same man the son had seen in the photo earlier, the man his father had betrayed. The daughter had the same haunted expression in her eyes, but there was something else, something more, something chilling. The woman pointed at the photo, her voice trembling as she spoke. "That girl was his only child. She disappeared years ago, and nobody ever found her. But your father knew where she had gone. He knew the pain he caused her, and he never forgave himself for what happened. He tried to make things right in his own way, but it was too late. The past, it never truly goes away, does it? The son's heart pounded in his chest. The revelation was staggering. His father had known about the girl, had been responsible for her disappearance. But what had happened to her? What was the connection to the strange cries from the coffin? He had to know more. Did she come to the funeral? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman's expression darkened. She did. But you have to understand, the girl you're looking for, she's not the same girl anymore. She's been changed by everything she's endured. She's not just a victim of your father's wrongdoings, she's someone who had to survive a world full of darkness. The son left the elderly woman's house, his mind reeling with the implications of everything he had learned. The family's hidden past was far darker than he could have imagined. But there was still more to uncover: the cries from the coffin, the violent horse, the mysterious woman. Everything seemed connected in a way that he couldn't yet understand. Back at home, he pored over the journal again, looking for any clue that might explain the connection between the family's secrets and the strange events of the funeral. But this time, his eyes lingered on one particular passage. His father had written about his regret, his desire to make amends. And just before his death, he had planned to meet with the family of the man he had betrayed, to finally apologize for the pain he had caused. But then, the final words struck him like a thunderclap: "She's coming for me. And when she does, there will be no escape." The son felt a chill run down his spine. His father's last thoughts, his final attempt to make things right, had been overshadowed by an even greater fear: fear of the woman whose life he had ruined, fear of the one who was now seeking vengeance. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to fall into place, but the truth was still elusive. The son knew that the only way to uncover the full story was to find this woman, to confront the very source of the cries from the coffin. But as he set out to track her down, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The past had come to haunt them all, and no one was safe until the truth was fully revealed. The son felt a weight on his shoulders, an unshakable burden as he ventured into the unknown. The photo, the journal, the haunting whispers of the past, it was all leading him to one inescapable conclusion: the woman in the photograph, the daughter of his father's betrayer, had returned, and her presence was tied to the strange, almost supernatural events that had occurred at the funeral. He knew that to fully understand what had happened, he had to find her, confront her, and face whatever had been buried for so long. But the search was not going to be easy. The more he tried to piece together the puzzle, the more he realized how well hidden this woman was. No one seemed to know where she had gone after her disappearance, and any trace of her life seemed to have been erased. His father's business partners and old associates had all been tight-lipped about the past, as though they were protecting a dark secret, one that no one was willing to revisit. The son's first step was to return to the old family home, the place where his father had lived before he'd moved away to escape his past. There, he hoped to find more clues that might lead him to her. The house was quiet now, abandoned by the family that had once lived there. It was as if the walls themselves were holding secrets, whispering them to anyone willing to listen. He began by searching through the old attic, a place he had never ventured into as a child. The dust was thick, and the air was stale, but there was something strangely comforting about being in this familiar space, even if it was now filled with the remnants of forgotten memories. It didn't take long before he came across an old chest, tucked away in the corner. He hadn't seen it before, but the rusted lock suggested it had been there for years. His heart raced as he pulled open the lid, revealing stacks of old letters and papers. As he sifted through the contents, a yellowed envelope caught his attention. It was addressed to his father, and the handwriting was unmistakable. It was from the man his father had betrayed. The letter was short but chilling. It spoke of threats, of promises made, and of a warning: you can run, but you can never escape what you've done. I will make sure you pay for your sins, and so will she. The son froze, his breath catching in his throat. She. The words were a haunting echo of the past, and now they seemed to hold even more weight. He had always wondered about the woman in the photograph, but now he understood that she was more than just a victim. She was an instrument of vengeance, a force tied to the very wrongs his father had committed. He needed answers, and the only way to get them was to find her. But where could she be? Had she truly vanished from the world, or had she been living in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make herself known? His next step was to visit the local authorities. He hoped they might have more information. Perhaps about any unusual events that had occurred recently. He knew it was a long shot, but he had nothing else to go on. When he arrived at the police station, he was met by an officer who had been working there for years. The officer recognized him immediately, having known his father and the family's history. The son introduced himself and explained the situation, the strange events at the funeral, the cries from the coffin, and the woman in the photograph. The officer listened carefully, but his expression remained unreadable. "I've heard stories," the officer finally said, his voice low. "Things you wouldn't believe. Your father was a man with a lot of enemies. And when those enemies disappear, well, sometimes, the truth comes back in the most unexpected ways." He hesitated, looking around before lowering his voice even more. "I don't know where she is now, but I can tell you this, your father's mistakes didn't just affect him. There were others, families torn apart, lives destroyed. The woman you're looking for, she's not just looking for revenge. She's looking for something else." The son's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" The officer looked around again, as if making sure no one was listening, before he leaned closer. "It's not just about your father. It's about her family, her life. She was taken from everything she knew, forced to live in hiding for years. She's spent all this time searching for the people who did this to her. And now, she's coming back to finish what was started." The words hit the son like a punch to the gut. The woman was not just a ghost of the past, she was a real person, a person with a mission. The cries from the coffin, the strange behavior of the horse, everything made sense now. She had come for what was rightfully hers. As the officer finished his tale, the son left the station, his mind swirling with new information. He had never imagined that his father's sins were so far-reaching, so tangled with the lives of others. The woman, whoever she was, had spent years plotting her revenge. But what did she want from him? And why had she waited so long to make her move? The son knew that the time had come to face the woman he had spent his entire life unaware of. The funeral had not just been a tragic accident, it had been the catalyst that set everything in motion. The pieces were falling into place, but the full truth still eluded him. One thing was certain, there was no turning back now. The investigation had begun, and it would lead him to a confrontation with the past that would change everything. The son felt as if he were on the edge of something far greater than he had anticipated. The investigation was no longer just about uncovering the secrets of his father's past, it was about confronting a woman who had been scarred by years of suffering, a woman who had witnessed the destruction of her own family, and whose pain had festered into something dark and vengeful. He spent the following days trying to piece together the final fragments of the mystery, but the deeper he went, the more elusive the answers became. He had learned enough to know that the cries from the coffin weren't some random anomaly. They were intentional. She, the woman in the photograph, the daughter of his father's betrayer, had orchestrated everything. The horse's panic, the breakdown of the coffin, and the disturbing sounds that had filled the air at the funeral were all part of a carefully laid plan. But why? What did she want, and how did it all tie back to his father? The son couldn't stop thinking about the officer's cryptic words, "She's not just looking for revenge. She's looking for something else." What was that something else? Had she come for answers? For closure? Or for something even more unforgivable? He turned back to his father's journal, desperately trying to find more clues, but it was the same entries, the same regrets over mistakes made long ago. His father's attempts to make amends had been futile, he had lived a life trying to outrun his own guilt. And now, the son was left to face the consequences of those actions. He had inherited more than just his father's legacy, he had inherited his father's unfinished business. A breakthrough came unexpectedly. While researching old local records, he came across an article that referenced an investigation into the disappearance of the man his father had wronged. The article briefly mentioned the man's daughter, a young girl who had been seen with him shortly before his disappearance, but then had vanished without a trace. There was little mention of what had happened to her afterward, but the headline caught his eye: a cold case with no closure. The case had gone cold years ago, the authorities unable to make any progress. But the article mentioned one important detail that the son hadn't come across before: the daughter was last seen visiting the family's old estate. It hit him like a bolt of lightning. The woman, the girl in the photograph, had never really disappeared. She had been there all along, living under their noses, silently observing the family from the shadows. The thought made the son's blood run cold. She had waited all these years for the right moment. She had waited until the very day his father's funeral to make her move. But why? Why now? In a desperate attempt to find her, the son returned to the family estate, the place where so many of the secrets had been buried. He had to find her, he had to know why she had come and what her intentions were. As he drove down the familiar road that led to the old house, memories from his childhood flooded his mind. This was the place where he had spent so many years, unaware of the darkness that had been looming over them all. The estate, which had once seemed like a home, now felt like a tomb, heavy with unresolved tension, with the remnants of lives torn apart by betrayal. He arrived at the property, where the house stood in silence, its windows dark and empty. It was a place frozen in time. The son walked around the perimeter, looking for any sign that someone had been here recently. And then, at the back of the property, he found it, a small, overgrown garden that had once belonged to his father's business partner, the man who had disappeared. The garden had always been a mysterious place, but he had never thought much of it until now. The air around the garden felt different, charged with a strange energy, as if the earth itself held the secrets of the past. The son knelt down and brushed aside the weeds that had overtaken the space. Beneath the tangled vines, there was something unusual, something metallic, something that didn't belong. His hands trembled as he pulled away the overgrowth to reveal a hidden compartment in the ground. The son's heart raced as he opened it, revealing a box, old, weathered, and locked. Inside, he found an assortment of items that seemed completely out of place: old letters, a collection of photographs, and a key, an old, rusted key that seemed to hold the key to something important. At the bottom of the box, buried beneath the clutter, was another photograph. It was the same woman, the one from the photo his father had kept hidden for so long. But this time, she was much older. And in the background of the picture, he could see something that made his stomach drop: a grave marker, a stone memorial with a name etched into it. The grave marker was for the man his father had betrayed. This was it. The woman had returned to confront them, not just for revenge, but to expose the truth, to force them to face the consequences of their actions. And now, with the photograph of the grave and the key, the son understood. The key was not just to a physical place, it was a symbol of something deeper. It was a key to unlocking the past, to revealing the ultimate truth that had been buried for so long. The cries from the coffin, the chaotic funeral, those had been the first steps. The woman had orchestrated it all. And now, it was time for the son to finish what his father had started. The past was no longer something they could run from. The truth would come out, whether they were ready for it or not. The son stood up, holding the key and photograph in his hands, knowing that the final confrontation was drawing near. The woman was close. And when they met, the full story of the past would finally be revealed. The son stood in the overgrown garden, the key and photograph clutched tightly in his hands. The air felt thick with the weight of everything he had uncovered, and for the first time, he realized just how deeply his father's past had intertwined with the very fabric of their lives. His family had been living in the shadow of a secret so dark that it had the power to change everything. But now, with the truth almost within reach, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. What would happen when the woman, the daughter of his father's betrayer, finally confronted them? He returned to the house, determined to make sense of the pieces of the puzzle that had been handed to him. The key seemed to hold the final answer, but he wasn't sure what it would unlock. The photograph of the grave marker confirmed what he had suspected: the woman was searching for answers just as much as he was. But what kind of closure could they both find after all these years? As he walked through the empty halls of the house, he reflected on everything his mother had said, all the words that had been left unsaid, the fear in her eyes. She had always been distant, always reluctant to talk about the past. The realization dawned on him that this had been a family secret, something that had been buried deep, not just by his father, but by his mother as well. They had all been living in denial, afraid to confront the truth. He walked into the living room, where his mother sat in her usual chair, a cup of tea untouched on the table beside her. She looked up at him, her face lined with worry. "What have you found?" she asked softly, her voice hesitant. "I found something," he replied, sitting down across from her. "I found the woman, the one from the photo. She's the key to everything. And I think she's been here all along." His mother's eyes widened, and for a moment, she seemed to freeze, as if the very mention of the woman's name had sent a shock through her. "No," she whispered, almost as if to herself. "No, she can't be." The son's heart ached as he looked at his mother, her face pale and drained of color. He could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear he had seen when he had asked her about his father's past. The truth was slowly unraveling, and she couldn't hide from it any longer. "She's come back for a reason, Mom," he said gently. "We need to face it. We need to confront the truth." His mother's hands trembled as she set her cup down on the table. She stared at it for a long time before looking up at her son, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know what you're asking, son. You don't understand what you're dealing with." The son's breath caught in his chest. "I understand more than you think. I understand that we've been living in the past for so long, and it's time to let it go." His mother shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "Your father, he did things he could never undo. And that woman, she was part of the consequences he couldn't escape. I was there, too. I saw it all." The son sat in stunned silence, his mind racing. "What do you mean you were there?" She sighed deeply, her voice strained. "Your father tried to protect us, to protect you. But the guilt ate away at him, day after day. The truth was something he could never share with you, never share with anyone. But I knew. I always knew. And I've carried that burden alone, hoping it would all just fade away." The son's heart sank. His mother had known everything all along, and yet she had kept it from him. She had protected him from the truth, just as his father had done. But now, with the woman's return, there would be no more hiding. The past was demanding to be heard. "We need to find her," he said, his voice firm. "We need to end this once and for all." His mother looked at him, a mixture of fear and resignation in her eyes. "You don't know what you're asking. She's not just seeking closure. She's seeking something more. And when she comes, nothing will ever be the same." The son stood up, his resolve unwavering. "I have to do this, Mom. I can't let it continue like this. The truth needs to come out." With that, he left the house, the key and photograph still in his hands. He knew where he needed to go, back to the graveyard, back to the place where the answers would be waiting. He had to find the woman before she found him. There was no more time for hesitation. As he approached the cemetery, his heart pounded in his chest. The wind was heavy, the sky overcast, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The graveyard was eerily quiet, the air thick with a sense of anticipation. He made his way toward the grave marker he had seen in the photograph. It was the same one, marked with the name of his father's betrayer. But this time, the woman wasn't alone. Standing by the grave, her back to him, was a figure draped in black. The woman, older now, but unmistakably the same person he had seen in the photograph. She turned slowly as he approached, her eyes locked onto his. "You've come," she said, her voice cold and calm, as though she had been waiting for this moment for years. The son's heart raced. "I'm here to listen. To understand." She nodded, a small, sad smile flickering across her face. "Then let me tell you the truth. Everything that's happened, everything you've endured, is a result of one man's mistake. And now, it's time for you to understand what he left behind." The son stood silent, the weight of everything he had uncovered settling over him. The past had come full circle, and now the truth would finally be revealed. But as the woman began to speak, he realized that this moment would change everything, forever. And the lesson they would all learn would be a hard one of forgiveness, redemption, and the inescapable cost of a life lived in regret. The wind howled through the graveyard, as if nature itself was pushing against the weight of the moment. The son stood before the woman, her face cold, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and determination. He could feel the years of tension between them, the years of pain that had been kept hidden beneath layers of silence. She had come to confront him, and to finally face the consequences of everything that had been buried for so long. She looked at him intently, as if weighing her next words carefully. "You want to understand, don't you?" she asked, her voice soft but unwavering. "You want to know why the past haunts us both, why we're trapped in this cycle?" The son nodded, his heart heavy. "I have to know. My father, his mistakes, they've haunted this family long enough. I need to know what happened, why all of this is happening now." The woman let out a long, deep sigh, and for the first time, the anger in her expression seemed to soften, replaced by something closer to sorrow. She glanced down at the grave marker, her fingers tracing the etched name as though it were the only connection to the past that still held any meaning. "I came here for answers too," she said, almost to herself. "For years, I've carried this anger. I blamed him for everything. For my father's death, for my life being torn apart. But what I didn't see, what I couldn't see, was that I wasn't the only one who was broken. We both were." The son's breath caught in his chest. He had always seen her as a victim, someone who had been wronged by his father's actions, but now, hearing her words, he realized that she too had suffered, perhaps more than anyone knew. The family's past wasn't just a story of betrayal and regret, it was a story of shared pain, a shared wound that had been left to fester for too long. "The man your father betrayed," she continued, her voice quieter now, "was my father. He was a good man, a man who had dreams and aspirations, but he trusted your father too much. Your father took advantage of that trust, and when my father was in trouble, when he needed help, your father abandoned him. My father tried to fight back, but it was too late. He ended up dead, and your father lived on with the guilt." She paused, her eyes locking onto his. "I couldn't let it go. I couldn't let him live in peace while my father was gone. But now, after all these years, I've realized something. Holding on to the anger, it was never going to bring my father back. It was never going to heal anything." The son felt a lump form in his throat. He had been so focused on his own pain, on the injustice that had been done to his family, that he hadn't stopped to think about what the woman had gone through. She had been carrying the same weight, the same bitterness, for years. And now, standing before him, it seemed like she was finally ready to let it go. "But what about the funeral?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "The cries from the coffin. The horse, why did you do that? Why did you choose that moment to confront us?" The woman's eyes softened, and she looked at him with a mixture of sadness and understanding. I thought it would give me some kind of closure. I thought that by shaking the foundation of your father's life, by causing the chaos that I knew would affect you all, I'd finally be able to make him feel what I had felt all these years. But it didn't work. It didn't bring the peace I was hoping for. All it did was drag us back into the past, keeping us locked in a cycle of hurt. She took a deep breath, as if releasing the weight of those years. I don't want revenge anymore. I don't want to hurt anyone. I just want to be free of this. I want to let go of all the anger, all the pain. And I think it's time for you to do the same. This isn't just about my father or your father. It's about both of us, and the way we've allowed our lives to be shaped by the past. The son stood still, processing her words. The storm of emotions within him began to settle, and the gravity of the situation started to sink in. This was the resolution he had been seeking, not vengeance, not blame, but understanding. The woman hadn't come to destroy them. She had come to help them both heal. He felt a weight lift from his chest, the burden of the past slowly being replaced by a sense of clarity. I understand, he said softly, his voice filled with a newfound sense of peace. I understand that we've all been victims of the past, and it's time to let it go. It's time to forgive. The woman nodded, a small, sad smile tugging at her lips. Forgiveness, it's the only way to move forward. I've spent my whole life carrying this weight, but now I see that it was never about punishing anyone. It was about finding peace. And maybe, just maybe, it's time for both of us to let go of this. For the first time, the son felt like he could breathe again. The cycle of anger and regret that had defined his family for so long was finally coming to an end. There was no easy fix, no way to undo the mistakes of the past, but there was forgiveness, and that was the key to moving on. They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of their shared understanding settling between them. The graveyard, once a place of sorrow and confrontation, now felt like a place of closure. And in that moment, the son realized that the greatest lesson of all had come not from seeking answers, but from learning to forgive, not just the woman, not just his father, but himself. The past would never be forgotten, but it no longer had the power to control their futures. The woman finally turned, her face softening with the release of years of pain. I'm sorry for everything, she said quietly. I'm sorry for the way things went. The son nodded, the words he had wanted to say for so long now coming easily. And I'm sorry too. For everything. With that, they both walked away from the grave, each carrying the lessons of the past, but leaving behind the burdens they had carried for so long. As the son walked away from the graveyard, his heart felt lighter than it had in years. The weight of the past no longer hung over him, no longer chained him to a cycle of bitterness and regret. He had learned something valuable, not just about his father's mistakes, not just about the woman who had sought revenge for so many years, but about himself. The greatest lesson he had learned was that forgiveness was not for the other person, it was for oneself. It was about freeing oneself from the shackles of the past and allowing room for healing and growth. For so long, he had clung to anger, to resentment, because it felt easier than facing the truth. But now, with the weight of it all lifted, he realized that true peace came not from revenge, but from letting go. The woman had come seeking justice, but what she found instead was a chance for both of them to heal. And in that healing, they both found the freedom they had been searching for. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but it was the only way forward. As the son stood at the entrance of the graveyard, looking out over the horizon, he knew that the future was no longer defined by the past. The mistakes, the regrets, the bitterness, they could all stay behind, buried in the earth. And now, with forgiveness in his heart, he was free to live the life that lay ahead. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer had to control his story. The son walked away, knowing that the greatest lesson he had learned was not about finding closure or revenge. It was about embracing the power of forgiveness, both for himself and for those who had hurt him. Because in the end, it wasn't about what had happened to them, it was about how they chose to move forward. And with that, the son stepped into the future, carrying the lesson of a lifetime with him. True peace begins when we let go of the past and choose to forgive.